This old painting had a secret that no one knew about until one night when the old man was home alone in his house, the painting changed. This is the creepy story of the painting that changed every night. It all started when Bernard went to a flea market with his wife. He saw a painting that immediately caught his attention. It was an oil painting of a house. The style was a bit outdated, and Bernard couldn't help but feel like he'd seen the house before, but he couldn't quite place it. There was something familiar about it, but he just couldn't remember what. Bernard asked the seller how old the painting was, and the old woman said she had no idea. She'd found it in her grandmother's attic and had brought it to the market hoping to make a quick buck. Bernard felt like there was more to the story, but didn't push it. Instead, he paid $200 for the painting and took it home. That night, Bernard hung up the painting in his living room. He chose this spot because it received very little foot traffic, so the painting would be left alone, but he couldn't help but keep going back to it. He sat down in front of it, trying to piece together why it looked so familiar. But after a while, he gave up. Instead, he poured himself a glass of wine and went to bed. The next morning, he came downstairs to find the painting covered in what looked like blood. He quickly realized it wasn't blood, but paint. Someone had taken a brush and traced over the original painting, changing it entirely. Bernard called his wife downstairs to take a look, but before she could even step foot in the living room, the painting changed again. They both stared in horror as they watched the painting change from the image of a house to what looked like a crime scene. It was as if the painting was coming alive right before their eyes. They were both confused and scared, so they did the only thing they could think of. They called the police. When the officers arrived, they took one look at the painting and immediately knew it wasn't dangerous. It was a prank. Someone had coated the original painting with a special type of paint that would react to UV light. By shining a black light into the room, the painting would appear to change. This was often done by street artists to pull off pranks like this. But who would do something like this? Bernard couldn't think of anyone who would want to play such a cruel joke on him. The officers left, and Bernard and his wife decided to hide the painting in the basement until they figured out what to do. But that night, it changed. Bernard and his wife were watching TV when suddenly they heard footsteps on the stairs. They turned to look and gasped in horror as they watched the painting change once again. But this time it was different. It wasn't covered in paint. Instead, it showed a bloodied meat cleaver. Bernard and his wife screamed, dropping the remote control as they ran and hid under the bed. They stayed there for hours until the sun came up and the painting changed back into the house. When they came upstairs, they noticed some wood shavings on the floor and a meat cleaver leaning against the wall. Bernard picked it up and examined it. The handle was made of wood, and the blade was incredibly sharp. He could tell that if the person who owned this cleaver ever swung it at him, it would definitely do some damage. Bernard called the police again, but this time they didn't believe him. They thought he was just trying to cover up the prank. So they told him to get over it and move on. Bernard was upset, but what could he do? The police wouldn't listen to him. So he and his wife decided to take matters into their own hands. They put the painting back in the living room and waited. And wait they did. For weeks the painting remained unchanged. Bernard began to think that maybe the police were right. Maybe it was just a prank. Then one night it changed again. Bernard and his wife were asleep when they heard a loud crash from downstairs. They got up to investigate, and that's when they saw it. The painting had changed again, and this time it showed Bernard being attacked with the very same meat cleaver. Bernard and his wife screamed and ran away. They never looked back as they sped away in their car. Bernard gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he needed to get away from that house. At the hospital, Bernard told the doctors that he hadn't been attacked. He knew that if he told them what really happened, they would just think he was crazy. So he kept quiet as they stitched up his wounds. When his wife came into the room, he told her that they needed to get rid of the painting. She agreed. They couldn't keep it anymore. But before they could, it changed again. This time it showed Bernard's wife standing over his dead body with the meat cleaver covered in his blood. She dropped the cleaver and gasped. Bernard was right. Something was wrong with this painting, and whatever it was, it seemed to be targeting them. Bernard and his wife tried to erase the painting, but nothing worked. They tried painting over it, but every morning the image would reappear. They tried ripping it, but the canvas was stronger than they were. In the end, they just gave up. They left the painting alone, hoping that whatever it was would eventually go away. But it never did. Every night, the painting would change, showing them a new and terrifying image. Sometimes it would show them being chased through the woods by a shadowy figure. Other times, it would show them being buried alive. Bernard began to lose his mind. He couldn't sleep or eat. All he could do was stare at the painting and wait for the next horrifying image to appear. One night, he saw an image that made him gasp. It showed the exact room he was in, except instead of a painting on the wall, there was a mirror. Bernard walked over and looked into the mirror. That's when he saw the horrifying truth. Behind him stood a shadowy figure holding the meat cleaver. Bernard turned around, but there was no one there. Then he remembered the house from the painting. It was his house. The painting had shown him the exact room he was in, except it wasn't his house. It was the house from the painting. Suddenly, everything made sense. The reason the house looked familiar was because it was his childhood home. He hadn't realized it until now, but the painting had somehow transported him back in time to the day he died. The shadowy figure wasn't a stranger. It was him. But why? Why was he being haunted by his own past? Bernard ran to the mirror, but it was too late. The painting had already changed. He looked back and saw the shadowy figure raise the meat cleaver. Then everything went black. When Bernard woke up, he was lying on the floor. He had a cut on his head and the room was spinning, but he didn't care about any of that. He looked around frantically, searching for the painting. That's when he saw it. It was leaning against the wall. He walked over and examined it. The paint was still wet. Then he looked down at his hands. They were covered in paint, too. Bernard had somehow traveled back in time and become the very thing he was trying to escape. He had become the painting. As the sun rose, Bernard knew he had only one chance to escape this nightmare. He grabbed the meat cleaver and swung it at the painting, slashing it to pieces. But as he did, he knew that he was also slashing himself. The painting fell to the ground, revealing Bernard's bloody corpse. Now you know why. No one should ever buy an old painting from a flea market. Do you? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please subscribe and I will see you next time. Bye.